You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your hosts, Andrew Chang and Justin Godwin.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo FAMBase podcast network, the originators of Bills Mafia. My name is Justin. I will be your host tonight, and I want to start out by thanking you for joining me today. Since you're already here, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Make sure you're not missing any episodes. We do have content coming out every Monday. You want to make sure you're not missing any of it. Tonight we're going to talk about a couple different things. I wanted to start out with, I guess, kind of more of a general scope of the NFL. Not directly Bills related, but, kind of Bills related when we get to the end of it. And that is Baker Mayfield getting traded to the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, this ends up being indirectly related to the Bills. Two quarterbacks taken before Josh Allen in the same draft, and Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield now on the Carolina Panthers. And boy, all the moves that the Panthers are making to bring these guys in, all the money that they're spending to take chances on these guys, and could have had Josh Allen. And as a Bills fan, never been happier to see a couple organizations whiff on a draft pick. Think that also speaks to the management, the coaching in Buffalo, that they were able to take on the obvious biggest project in the draft, and through Josh's dedication, hard work, through what they were able to coach him up with, he ends up being, for my money, the best quarterback in the draft. And then, obviously, Lamar Jackson can be in the conversation, but very thankful as a Bills fan that we ended up with what ends up being the right Josh, despite how much I wanted Josh Rosen at the time. Who knows? Maybe we'll see the Carolina Panthers go out and bring in Josh Rosen as their third-string quarterback, and really fill out that first-round promise there. The next thing I wanted to touch on, and this is going to kind of lead into what I wanted to talk about today, and that was a couple lists I saw come out from ESPN. And if you've listened to any of these episodes in the past, you know, at least for me, I'm not big on rankings, top 10, top 20, the top 100 NFL list. It's not really for me. I try to stay more focused on our organization and what's going on here. But every once in a while, I see one of these lists come out, and the snubs are just kind of egregious. And I saw two different lists, and it was top 10 safeties and top 10 cornerbacks, and all three, Jordan Poyer, Micah Hyde, and Tre'Davious White, were all left off of their respective lists, and it just kind of makes me wonder what games ESPN is watching at a time. But it also kind of led me into my thought of what I wanted to talk about today. And that was kind of the underrated players on the Bills right now. We have our Stephon Diggs, we have Trey White, Josh Allen, these guys that get like the mainstream attention, the buzz from the national media. And I was looking at it as, there's 11 guys on the field for the offense and defense at all times. And despite how great some of these players are, it does take all 11 to make it all click. And I guess these are just a few players that I picked out as underrated. Not to say that there's not more. There's certainly less than there used to be when we had all these, few years back, all these just scrappy underdogs trying to prove themselves in the NFL. Definitely a much more complete team that we're trotting out there these days. But kind of wanted to give some love to a few players on each side of the ball that don't necessarily get the same buzz as some of the bigger name players. And the first one I want to start out with on offense is It's kind of a strange one for me. I went back and forth between this player and Rick Bates, and I landed on Roger Saffold, and it was kind of a tough pick for me because he hasn't played for the Bills yet. So this is kind of, based a little bit in projection. But just looking at the player that he's been in the NFL and some of the struggles that we had across the offensive line last year, and the reason I landed on Saffold over Rick Bates is we kind of know a little bit more about Bates, and we saw the line struggle with Feliciano at the left guard, and when Bates came in, it kind of solidified that, and we still had question marks on the right side. Darrell Williams obviously gone now. And from what we saw from Bates last year, he looks like he's going to be a pretty solid starter for us going forward. And the question then became, who's going to be the other guard? And they didn't go out and get, some sort of placeholder. They got Roger Saffold, a bona fide starting guard in the NFL. He's, I believe, in his 13th season, and he's just been a proven starter. And it was kind of, if Bates was going to be that next left guard taking over for Feliciano, it was, who's going to be at right guard? How do we reestablish at least that floor of what we had in the tail end of last season? For my money now, it's kind of looking like, despite how well Bates played last year, in theory, with the way the line is setting up right now, and if it's playing out the way I feel like it will, that kind of makes Rick Bates the weak link across the offensive line. And if that's the weak link that we have right now, that's the little bit that we have to overcome. It makes the signing of Roger Saffold that much more important, that you have to call Rick Bates the weak link, but I don't really see a weak link across the offensive line now. So despite not having seen him play a down for the Bills yet, if he comes in, he's even, 60% of the player that I expect him to be for this team. I think that's something that will maybe fly a little bit under the radar. The offensive line isn't the sexiest of positions, especially when you're talking interior line. But the effect that can have on the rest of the offense, on the rest of the line, how they work together, maybe we can get a little bit better run blocking and get some of the other guys going. So I think that's going to be a really, really underrated signing. Somebody that's going to end up being an underrated player that really shines through. The next guy I wanted to talk about was Jamison Crowder. Another guy that has a good amount of NFL starting experience, a lot of productivity, and when we look at the receiver room in Buffalo, it's obviously number one, you got Diggs. The number two thing people are talking about is Gabe Davis, and can he take on more workload? What's he going to look like taking the next step? What's he going to look like when he's not the number 4 receiver and he has, better cornerbacks playing against him? And then I would say the third thing that comes up when you're talking about the receiver room is we just kind of skip past Crowder and we start looking at kind of that number 4 receiver position and the depth there. And I'm not speaking for everybody, but I've certainly done this. It's kind of like, yep, Crowder's there. What do we have coming up the pipeline? We have drafted Khalil Shakir. We have Isaiah McKenzie. We have Stevenson from last year, Hodgins. Looking for which one of these guys is going to be the next guy that steps up. But when I look at a guy like Crowder in this offense, theoretically kind of filling that Cole Beasley type of role, I look at Cole Beasley's production from last year, 82 catches and 693 yards, and kind of wanted to match that up against, what did Crowder do last year? And it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. Two very different teams in their life cycle. But with how bad of a team the Jets had last year, having a rookie quarterback trying to learn his way, having Mike White come in, somebody else played some snaps there. Just a whole lot of circumstances going on, and Crowder was still able to come away with 51 catches, 447 yards. Now, it's not a one-for-one swap for Cole Beasley and in the production there, but also with a quarterback like Josh Allen, who is now established himself as a top-tier NFL quarterback. He's gone through the growing pains. He's shown time after time that he's elevating receivers around him. You look at how many people had career years coming to Buffalo: John Brown, Cole Beasley. It's just a receiver that already has the talent. He already has the productivity. And I think him coming into this system and having Diggs and having Davis and having Knox to take attention away from him, I think there's going to be game plans that we see. We saw it with New England. We saw it with the Chiefs, where they're just hell-bent on taking Stephon Diggs out of the game and daring somebody else to beat them. And I think Crowder coming out of the slot is going to be able to hurt a lot of teams if they kind of take that focus away from him to put onto Diggs and Davis. And then the last guy I got here, I'm going to say he's my most underrated player on the offensive side of the ball. And that for me is Devin Singletary right now. And the Devin Singletary situation kind of reminds me a little bit of what Levi Wallace went through here for years. It was kind of like he's doing his thing, playing pretty well, but looking like there's room to upgrade. And, we see drafting Zach Moss. I think that was more of kind of to complement Singletary. But players kind of being given the opportunity to try and go win that job. And Singletary's been steady, and there's a certain aspect to him of his elusiveness that I think goes kind of underrated because he doesn't have these gaudy stats and the breakaway speed to kind of put it all together. But when we're looking at what he's done over the last couple of years, and we're able to be here talking about offensive line struggles we've had, in particular in the running game, I start looking up some stats on Devin Singletary, and I see from Football Outsiders, so over the last 2 years, with running backs tallying 200-plus carries over the last 2 seasons, Singletary leads the league in broken tackle percentage at 23.5%. And you start looking at that like, man, he's breaking this many tackles. Like, how are his numbers not just bananas? And then I start rewatching games and playing through, how many times was that first missed tackle? He's getting hit in the backfield and he makes a guy miss and makes a second guy miss. And all of that was happening behind the line of scrimmage, so it ends up being a 2-yard carry. There's just so many times that you get Singletary in the open field and he's kind of one-on-one with a guy, and he does one of those little back steps or little juke. And my guy Vince, if any of you guys used to listen to Buffalo on the Brain with Vince Taylor, every week he was talking about how Singletary reminds him of like a budget version of Barry Sanders. And I think this missed tackle percentage kind of points to that. And this kind of goes along with my idea of Roger Saffold and how important that he could be to this team. If we can get Singletary consistently, at 2 yards before he's making the first guy miss, some of those carries that are, he's just kind of making people miss and just trying to get back to the line of scrimmage, and he ends up making 2-3 guys miss and it's a 3-yard gain. If you can start doing that, just beyond the line of scrimmage and get him one-on-one with some linebackers, get him one-on-one with some secondary players, get a blocker or two in front of him, and then let him use that elusiveness that he has, even with how much this offense likes to pass the ball, and even with the drafting of James Cook and Zach Moss still being in the building, I think Singletary's still going to get his share of touches. And if we can have that improved line in front of him, I think he's going to be a really dangerous running back, not just for the Bills, but in the grand scheme of the NFL. I think he has that kind of intangible shiftiness to make him a really dynamic player, despite not having that, ridiculous top end speed. So we'll see how that all plays out, but those are my three guys on offense that I'm kind of looking for. We're not really talking about them a ton this time of year, and guys that I think are going to have a gigantic impact on this coming season. I'm going to take a quick break. Stick around. We're going to come back and touch on the defensive side of the ball.
Hey, this is Brother Bill. Now back to the show.
Welcome back, everybody. And thank you again for tuning into this episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast. Again, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe. Want to make sure you're not missing any episodes, and it does help us out immensely. Also, while you're there, if you want to drop a comment, leave any sort of feedback, something you'd like to see us talk about in the future, go ahead and leave that. We read all the comments, take them all into consideration, so we appreciate the feedback, and thank you for any of your support. We're going to dive back in on this discussion of underrated players on the team coming up for this season, and we're going to talk about a few guys on the defensive side of the ball. And the first one I want to start out with is Taron Johnson. And Taron Johnson is an interesting case to me because we're so close to the situation of him being benched for Cam Lewis and, looking like he wasn't playing very well and, kind of having to earn his job back. And in the same season, it's going back 2 years ago now to his late season heroics, the pick six against Baltimore, the pick against the Steelers, kind of really solidifying a couple playoff wins for this team. And I remember going into last season kind of thinking, are we reading in too much to these heroics? Like, was that kind of a flash in the pan and we should expect this regression to the mean for him? And I think he kind of took last season and he got the contract extension, and I think he was really able to grab the reins and really take control of that nickel cornerback position. And I think it's so important for a team that plays as much base nickel as we do. And I think Taron Johnson does get his love, don't get me wrong. But when I'm talking, underrated on this defense, and we talk about these names that we have in the secondary, and Trey White and Poyer and Hyde, and then kind of that constant conversation about, who's CB2? Is this the year Levi's going to get replaced? Can Dane Jackson be a long-term number 2 option? I think the nickel spot for how our team plays defense is really kind of just an extension of a cornerback 2. I'll call it cornerback 3 if you want to. But he's another guy that's a full-time starter out there, and he really is able to lock down his position almost as well as any of the other cornerbacks on the field and kind of just playing in the slot. We don't talk about it as much. And I think for what it's worth, I think he outplays Levi Wallace. He doesn't do it on the outside, but I think he had a better overall season than Levi Wallace. And, we're still having that conversation about, is it going to be Levi going forward? Obviously, it's not now. But could Dane Jackson take that step? Are we going to draft a guy? We draft Kaiir Elam, and we're still here talking about Trey White and who's playing opposite him. And I don't know. I guess maybe he's not as underrated as I'm stating it, but I thought this was a good opportunity to give Taron Johnson a little love. He's just been playing great over the last 2 seasons, and I'm glad we have him locked up long-term as that nickel cornerback. Which kind of leads me into my second one here, and this one, similar to the Roger Saffold one, was a little strange to me, but I guess something I wanted to talk a little bit more about, and that's going to be the cornerback 2 position. And I originally wrote down Dane Jackson as an underrated player here, and then I kind of did like a slash Kyer Elam. And I guess for me, Dane Jackson was somebody that, had we not drafted Kyer Elam, I would have been comfortable going into this season with Dane Jackson at number 2, if it was under a few different circumstances. Largely for that was the health of Trey White. So if we knew right now going into the season that Trey White would have been ready week 1, I would have been okay with Dane Jackson being the starting cornerback 2, and maybe exploring our options for some depth options or some, maybe future replacements for Dane Jackson a little bit later in the draft. But the situation as it was, not knowing if we're going to have Trey White week 1, that would kind of thrust Dane Jackson into that CB1 role. And I don't think he's quite there yet, but as far as the limited action that we've seen from him at cornerback 2, I mean, it's got to be the first play that flashes up in everybody's head is that game against the Cardinals, and somebody went down. I think Levi Wallace went down for a little bit, and we see Dane Jackson come in, and first play, everybody's looking at it, and they target Dane Jackson. He's matched up one-on-one with Nuke Hopkins, and he breaks it up right in the front corner of the end zone. And I think there's been several plays like that, and there's been some pretty consistent play from Dane Jackson. And he almost kind of reminds me of a Levi Wallace, kind of in that he doesn't have this freakish athleticism skill set. But in this defense, it's really about doing your job and kind of keeping everything in front of you and making sure that you make the tackle. And I think Dane Jackson did that very well in the limited action, again, that we saw. And then as far as Kyer Elam goes, I don't know if I want to put this in underrated category or overrated. It's kind of like a weird area because there's so much expectations for him, so much excitement to see him play across from Trey White. But I guess this is, for me, I put him in this underrated category for right now. More on how much I think it's underrated of what his value is going to be of him doing his job for what he's asked to do. And I guess to kind of elaborate on that more is, myself included, so much of Bill's Mafia has been looking at that cornerback 2 position for years, and this includes the organization kind of bringing in people to compete with Levi Wallace and trying to give opportunities for somebody to earn that job away from him. And Levi Wallace just constantly proving that that job belonged to him. And he was never really the flashiest player. He could get picked on in certain circumstances, but week in and week out, you knew what that floor was with Levi. You knew that you might go into a game where he might give up, 6, 7, 8 catches. But usually in games like that, it was 6, 7, 8 catches for like 70 yards because he would kind of play with that buffer, and he would come up and almost never miss a tackle. So I guess the underrated aspect of Kyer Elam is if he comes in and he's going to be the starting cornerback too, he does have a little bit more of the athletic traits. He does have a little bit more explosiveness. But that floor of consistently making sure the ball doesn't get behind you and making sure you didn't, try to jump a route that you couldn't get to, and all of a sudden, an 8-yard catch turns into 30, 40, 50 yards because you didn't keep the ball in front of you. So that's why I have him listed as the underrated side here. I guess it's more underrated. I think we're underrating what we need him to do to maintain the floor of this defense. And then my number 1 for underrated player here, and again, this is going to be somebody coming from outside of the organization, is Daquan Jones. And Daquan Jones for me is underrated in the role that he's going to be asked to do. And this is kind of like that thankless role on defense, the big guy in the middle that can eat up blocks and, let people play free. And, he's sitting at 6'4", 320. I think his contribution to this defense is going to be underrated in that this is kind of the role that we've been looking for from Star Lotulelei for the past 2-3 years, and be it injuries or I know there was the COVID opt-out year, and then he missed time last year because of COVID, but the defense did look different when Star was in there and playing well, and we saw Ed Oliver playing next to Star and looking like his hair was on fire on some games. And I think that Daquan Jones we're bringing him in to replace that Star Lotulelei role. And I think just if he can stay healthy and be available and kind of just play at that same floor that Star Lotulelei played at, I think it's going to just have an immense impact on this defense. And obviously defense that was already, number one overall in the league last year. I think part of me thinks that defense is kind of just scratching the surface of what it can actually be, because Star Lotulelei missed so much time and was playing such a pivotal role for this defense. You think about some of the other additions that we've made in this offseason, in the secondary, adding Kyrie Elam, still having Poyer, Hyde, Trey White back there, Taron Johnson. You bring in Von Miller, Tim Settle, some of these younger pass rushers that we have in Rousseau, Epinesa, Groot. There's just so many pieces that can be affected starting right up front with Daquan Jones. We talk about Tremaine Edmonds being in a contract year, and there's been a lot of talk about Tremaine Edmonds and not being able to get off of blocks and whatever you want to say. What I'm hoping to see with this addition of Daquan Jones is just Tremaine Edmonds not having to deal with half of those blockers that are getting to the second level to get to him. Matt Milano being able to play free. And Daquan Jones, not a guy that I'm expecting to, fill up stat sheets and get all these tackles for loss and getting after the quarterback. I don't think that's what he's here for. But when you have a guy like that can eat up, 2 blockers on a play, now you got on the other side of him is Ed Oliver. On the other side, on the two ends, you got Groot and you got Von Miller. There's only so many guys that you can go double team on this, and Ed Oliver kind of had a coming out party last year. He was really getting in the backfield, and same thing. He didn't really fill up the stat sheet with a ton of sacks, but when you're watching the games and you see how much he's in the backfield and how much he was making the quarterback make quick decisions, that led to some picks. It led to some sacks. It led to lots of incomplete passes and bad decisions. Now when you're talking about Ed Oliver being able to move more freely, and you add a guy like Von Miller into the mix, Von Miller's a guy that you should be doubling on every play. And for my money at this point, Ed Oliver could maybe be said the same. So if you have Jones in the middle eating up those blocks, maybe we see a guy like Groot really start to flourish, and he's getting one-on-one matchups all the time. And then when you start game planning against the Bills, it's kind of like, well, what are we supposed to do? They got weapons coming from all over, and we're not even getting into, blitz packages and things like that. The Bills like to use a nice cornerback blitz. All of a sudden you got 5 guys on the offensive line trying to take care of this Pro Bowler and Von Miller, and Daquan Jones ate up 2 blocks, and then you sent a cornerback on top of it. I just think that starting right up front, we've seen this since Bean and McDermott came into town, just really building through the trenches. And, I do have a little bit of like cautious optimism here because we have seen a ton of investments into the defensive line, but this year just feels really different to me. I think Daquan Jones is going to be a great addition, kind of an unsung hero, and then we're not even getting into, Jordan Phillips coming back and Shaq Lawson and Tim Settle coming in. Just all across that defensive line, I think there's a ton of talent and a ton of opportunity, and Daquan Jones is going to be that centerpiece that kind of frees everybody up to work for me. So that's my 3 picks on offense and defense for kind of underrated players that I think are going to have giant seasons for the Bills this year. There's a ton of different options, ton of different ways you could look at this. So if you have different thoughts, you want to jump in the discussion, leave a comment. We'll get back to you and kind of just feel out what your thoughts are, and maybe you change my mind on a couple of these. But that's going to do it for tonight's episode. Thank you again for joining us. We will be back next Monday. My name again is Justin. You can find me on any social medias at jgods22. You can find my partner in crime, Andrew. He is on vacation right now. He'll be back shortly. You can find him on any social media at 2changs. That's going to do it for tonight. Go Bills.